Melissa, you're making a strong contention here. It's China that's profiting out of our resources. Is that what you argue?
Well, I think the Africa-China relationship has been beneficial to Africa's growth story as well. Yes, it has.
I'm looking for figures.
And I think the potential for deeper trade going forward not only benefits China in terms of broadening its export market and sort of satisfying its ever-growing appetite for resources, but it also assists Africa in terms of becoming and further establishing itself as a global player. African exports to China increased to about 17% at the end of 2010, this coming from only 5% at the end of 2000. And I think as China's economy continues to grow, I think we can definitely see China exceeding Europe and the United States and becoming Africa's main export destination.
Now, Melissa, one of the arguments that we've been having, and I think it's sort of permeated the discussions that we've had this evening, is the whole issue around how Africa has been benefiting out of the relationship with China, particularly when you look at the fact that most of Africa's exports to China are raw materials, and there's very little beneficiation. And as a result, some are saying part of the reason why you're hearing calls for nationalization of the mines here in South Africa is because on the ground, the majority are not profiting out of this. How beneficial has been this relationship to Africa if we take outside the raw numbers?
Well, I think you have to acknowledge the fact that Africa does benefit, firstly, from the fact that there's a very secure export market for its commodities.
So we've got a buyer for our products.
Okay. Secondly, the fact that there's high commodity prices for our key commodities.
Because of the demand coming out of China.
Precisely. Thirdly, China's investment into Africa has been very different to that of the West, in the sense that China doesn't support budgets of African countries directly, which I personally think is a much better way of investing on the continent, because you're not just funding their recurrent expenditure every month, but you're actually investing in infrastructure projects that allow them to have a more sustainable, positive economic growth path going forward.
But those infrastructure projects are designed in such a way that they take out of Africa our resources onto China minus beneficiation. Should that be allowed, or should we look at a situation where we say, let's first of all put in the plants, the machinery that allows us to transform our platinum into the catalytic converters that are needed for cars, or should we then make our jewelry here in Africa before we take out when we dig out our gold out of the ground?
I think rightfully so. One of the biggest challenges for Africa in this is in terms of maximizing the benefits, in terms of growth, employment, and the transfer of expertise. And if Africa can in fact manage to do this, then it'll be a win-win situation for both the continent and for China, and there'll be a mutually beneficial relationship going forward.
So let's talk then about the volumes and where these have come in terms of the trade between Africa and China that we've seen in the past few years.
I think most people generally focus on Africa's exports to China, but they actually tend to forget about Africa's imports from China. And that we've seen grown as well. It stood at about 14% at the end of 2010. And on the export side, most export products to China are fuel and mining products. These include primarily petroleum, iron ore, copper, and coal. And between the 2009 and 2010 period, China accounted for about 10% of global demand for petroleum. And about 28% of this was sourced from sub-Saharan Africa, with Angola alone accounting for 20% of that. So it's really big numbers. And during that same period, China accounted for about 28% of the global copper demand, with sub-Saharan Africa sourcing about 6% of that. So these are big numbers. And definitely, African exports to China as a percentage of GDP does vary across the region, but I think you'll definitely find your resource-abundant economies that have the largest ratios, like your Angola and your Zambia.
Okay, so how do we balance this relationship? You know, maybe let me phrase the question differently. Is this relationship balanced from your perspective right now as it stands?
I think it obviously is not balanced if you look at the fact that African exports to China sits at 17%, yet African imports sit at 14%. But I think you have to bring into account the FDI that China is pushing into this continent.
Do we class the Chinese investment into Africa as FDI, given that it's directed to specific sectors for specific reasons?
I think it is definitely classified as FDI if those African markets can use that infrastructure that Chinese companies are funding for for their benefit over the longer term.
Beyond sending the materials to
I mean,
to China.
Chinese FDI into sub-Saharan Africa stood at about $11 billion at the end of 2010, which is a very big amount, but it is only 3% of total Chinese FDI to the rest of the world.
Sure.
At the same time, the biggest beneficiaries have been South Africa, Nigeria, Zambia, Angola, and Congo. And I think this comes as no surprise because those are the economies that are most rich in terms of commodities. But I think it's important to note that that FDI is actually quite diverse within each of those economies as well, which you wouldn't normally expect. And I think this shows in the current construction of things called special economic zones.
Right.
So there's 6 of them currently being constructed. And within these zones, you will see that the focus is not primarily on the extraction of commodities, but it's also more so on the manufacturing of textiles and machinery. And I think in this case, China is actually trying to replicate the success it had in the 1980s, where it builds these special economic zones and it focuses predominantly on manufacturing.
Okay, final question. So China for Africa, good or bad?
For me, I think the biggest...
one word, Melissa.
Good.
Good. Good it is. Good it is.